Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now that it's 3:05. So hello, welcome. This is the 2022 Intellectual Property Speaker Series, which is presented by MIT's Technology Licensing Office and the MIT Libraries. My name is Sadie. I'm going to moderate today and check things in the Q&A. If you have a question during this session, feel free to put it in the Q&A right away. And if it's important to our understanding at that moment, I'll interrupt Katie and we can talk about it. Otherwise, you can check the Q&A for other people's questions and upvote them or add comments to them or things like that. So let's get started with our session today, which is called The Basics of Fair Use and is going to be presented by Katie Zimmerman, who's the MIT Library's Director of Copyright Strategy. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Sadie. I'm happy to be here today. We're going to be talking about fair use. Let's see. I think Sadie pretty much said these things, but the slides are available at that link, which is also in the chat. Please feel free to say hello and comment in the chat. We're going to be using the chat a little bit throughout the webinar to talk a little bit about the stuff that we're doing. And then also, please feel free to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. So today's topic is fair use. We are specifically talking about copyright fair use. This is the intellectual property speaker series. We're focusing on only one aspect of intellectual property today, which is copyright. There is also a fair use doctrine in trademark law, but that's beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're talking about copyright. What is copyright? Copyright applies to lots of types of materials. It applies to text, images, video, music, cultural materials, things that you would think of like that. And it gives a pretty broad set of controls to the person who controls the copyright for that material. So if you control the copyright to something, you control the right to reproduce it, to make copies of it, to modify it, so to maybe translate it into another language, create an adaptation in a different medium, create a movie out of this short story, things like that. The right to distribute it, so the right to sell it, the right to lend it to people, and then the right to publicly perform and publicly display things. So that's a pretty broad set of rights that controls a lot of things that people might want to do with something that is protected by copyright. But those rights are not absolute. And that is the main thing we're going to be talking about today, which is fair use. So fair use is our kind of broad general exception to copyright. And it is really, it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's what do we think is fair that you shouldn't have to pay a fee or ask permission or get anyone's approval to be able to do. There are certain things that we think that applies to. We use it every day in our lives. There are lots of things that you do where you're relying on fair use and you may not even realize it because it just seems so obvious that you shouldn't have to ask permission for that. But you are in fact relying on fair use when you do that. So fair use is a statutory right. This is a snippet of the statute, and it says that the fair use of a copyrighted work for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research is not an infringement of copyright. So that's the beginning of the statute. That's not the whole thing. Those are kind of illustrative examples rather than being the end of the story. Just because something is in one of those categories doesn't mean that it's automatically a fair use, but it's a pretty good indicator, and those things are very likely to be fair uses. But there are things that are not in that list that can also be fair uses, as we will see. So the statute also gives us, because just saying it seems fair is a little bit hard to determine, the statute also gives us a 4-factor test to determine whether or not something is a fair use. And these 4 factors are, they're designed to be flexible, they're designed to be able to apply to new technologies and new situations without having to go back to Congress and say, is this fair? Is this fair? Is this fair? It's designed to be a flexible test that applies to a lot of things. But one of the downsides of it being that flexible of a test is that sometimes it doesn't give you as clear of answers as you might like. So you do have to think it through. You do have to apply it to the specific facts of any particular case. But there are some kind of general principles that we can distill from it. But it is a holistic analysis rather than a strict formula. Okay. So what are these 4 fair use factors? This is kind of an abbreviated version of them, and then we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So the first fair use factor is the purpose and character of your use. So you being the person who wants to use someone else's thing, you're making use of it. What are you doing with it? Do we think that what you're doing with it should be considered a fair use such that you don't need to get permission? The second factor you look at is what is the nature of the thing that you are using? Is it something that we really want to protect under copyright, or is it something that we protect a little bit more generally? How much are you using? Do you really need to be using it? And the amount that is taken by your use. And then what is the market effect of your use? What is the effect of your use on the person who created the original thing? It's there's kind of a no harm, no foul aspect that comes in there. So let's look at each of these factors a little bit in more depth. And the first factor is really the one that has come to dominate in recent years. So fair use is determined. When you're using something, you have to have a good sense of whether or not it's a fair use. But if you actually need a determination of whether something is a fair use, it has to go to a judge and it has to go to a court. So we have certain things that have gone through the courts that we can then use to extrapolate what other things that we're doing now might be a fair use. And the purpose and character of the use, the first factor, has dominated in the judicial interpretation of fair use in recent years. So under this factor, there are a bunch of things that help. If your use is non-commercial, if you're not making money, that helps a lot. Same with if it's educational, if it's news reporting, commentary, scholarship and research, those things that are mentioned in the prelude to the fair use statute. But the thing that it comes down to in a lot of cases is your use transformative? So are you using this thing as a means to another end? Are you using it to add something new with a further purpose or different character, altering the first with new expression, meaning, or message, as opposed to you're kind of doing the same thing with it that it was intended for, and you should really be paying for that. So that quote about adding something new, that comes from the Supreme Court case that gives us this. And that is a case called Campbell versus Acuff Rose, which is a case about Two Live Crew. So it's a music case. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now. And so this is a case between the Roy Orbison estate and Two Live Crew. Two Live Crew created a parody version of a Roy Orbison song. The Roy Orbison estate objected, and they ended up in courts. And the question is this a fair use? So just to give you a sense of the question here, I'll play just a little bit of both of these songs so that you can see what we're talking about here. Here's the original Roy Orbison. And so here's the Two Live Crew version. Jump forward. So we weren't expecting that on a Friday afternoon, right? So clearly, there's no denying this is the same song, right? This is using the same source material. They're not denying that. They're calling it the same thing, and in this case, they actually even asked permission first, and then the Roy Orbison estate said, "No, we don't really like what you're doing with this. Please don't," and they did it anyway. But the court says that this is that's fun. But the court says that this is in fact a fair use. So this is the Supreme Court of the United States. It says that they're transforming and adapting this. The Two Live Crew is juxtaposing the romantic musings of a man whose fantasy comes true with degrading taunts. They're commenting on the naivete of the original, rejecting its sentiment, and saying something different. So they're using the content from the first one in order to say something different, in order to comment on it. And it doesn't make a difference that they're selling it for money. It doesn't make a difference that it's commercial. This is the core of fair use, where we want to allow people to say things about society and about other cultural works without impediment from copyright. And that's really where the heart of the transformative use analysis comes from in recent years. So that is an example, and our example of the first factor. To continue through the factors, the second factor is the nature of the work that is being used. This factor has kind of been of diminishing importance in recent years, although we are going to talk about one recent case that has kind of brought it back a little bit. But things that go into the second factor, if the work is highly factual as opposed to highly creative, then copyright isn't quite as concerned with protecting it. Copyright is about protecting creativity. If you're further away from that core of the things that we want copyright to protect, then it's going to be easier to fairly use something. The other thing that sometimes comes up in the second factor analysis is whether the work was published or not. Copyright is slightly more protective of things that people were trying to keep private. So private letters, things like that, might be slightly harder to fairly use under this factor. But if it's been published, it's kind of been put out there into the world. Copyright is more amenable to that being used by other people. So that's the second factor. The third factor is the amount taken. And there are a lot of myths that you hear about this factor. There are a lot of like rules of thumb that you may have heard of, like 1 chapter or 10% or 5 seconds or something like that. None of those are in the law, and those can be very misleading. So the question here is, are you taking a reasonable, it's a reasonableness standard largely. We're back to is this fair? And this is proportionate to the transformative use. So if you need to use the whole thing in order to make a transformative purpose, then you can. So, and we can see that in the Two Live Crew case. They used pretty much the whole song. They used the lyrics, they used the beat, they used the background melody. They used pretty much the whole thing, but they had that strong transformative purpose. So this factor didn't count against them quite as much. With that said, generally under this factor, less is better. You want to use the amount that you need, but you don't want to just use someone's stuff because you can. So the more you can justify it, if you have a good justification, you're all set. But if you don't, then less is better.
Katie, just to go back to something from factor 2, someone had a question. How do you define published? Does it include news, YouTube, other things? What are the specifics around that?
Yeah, good question. So published is not particularly defined in this context, but I think it would. It's really about public availability rather than some sort of formal status. So I think if you're releasing it to the world, if you're releasing it on YouTube, if it's been reported in the public news, then that would help under that factor. The unpublished material that gets protected more highly under the second factor. There's a case where, for example, like the draft of a book gets leaked before it's actually been published, and someone scoops the story of the thing that's being announced in that book. So something like that, that's going to be less likely to be a fair use. But yeah, just kind of public disclosure more than formal publication. Okay. So we've talked about the second factor, we've talked about the third factor. The fourth factor is the market effect of your use. And this is really about, are people going to buy your thing instead of their thing? Are you usurping the market for the thing that you're using versus providing something different? And you can think about this with the Roy Orbison case. Probably people who are listening to Two Live Crew are not listening to Two Live Crew instead of Roy Orbison. Those are probably relatively different markets. You're not usurping the Roy Orbison market by putting out this rap parody of Roy Orbison. So that's an example of that. It doesn't have to be an established market. It can also be a likely market. So that can be things like a movie hasn't been made out of this story, but it's plausible that it could be. And then if you jump the gun and tried to do that and argue fair use, that might not work so well because that's a standard thing that people might do. And then another thing that sometimes comes in under this factor is there a market available where you could have easily gotten permission? So like, is this kind of a customary sort of thing that there is a customary market for that you're just going behind the back of? Versus, is this really something new that you're doing and something that you couldn't have done through the standard method? One implication of that, which is kind of interesting, is that fair use is kind of a use it or lose it sort of thing. If you get a standard market established for something that would have been a fair use, then that diminishes the fair use argument under this factor. So you really have to use fair uses if you want to maintain them. Okay.
We had another question that came in, and I just want to bring it up now because it's about the Two Live Crew example. So they asked, would the transformative defense have worked if this had been used in a non-degrading manner?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I think it would depend on what it was, but I think it would be a less strong fair use if it hadn't been so different, right? So if it had been a feel-good song, you know, the fact that it was differentiating itself from Roy Orbison and kind of making fun of Roy Orbison in as much as it did was part of the fair use argument under the factor. So if you're just using the beat because you think it's catchy and you like it, then that is going to be less strong of a fair use. Whereas if you can make an argument that you're commenting on the original, that you have a completely different message that you're bringing into it, then that helps build that argument. And there are certainly several fair use cases where you kind of get the sense that people are building that argument after the fact. But that is something that you can do to enhance your fair use argument. Okay, so this is great. So that's an overview of the factors. And then really the way to kind of wrap your head around this is to look at a bunch of examples. So I'm going to give us some examples. The examples that I'm going to start with are, I have forgotten 2 slides, sorry. So you take all the factors, you weigh them all together. The important thing to say here is that not all factors are equal. So I mentioned that the second factor is decreasingly of importance recently. It's also just on a case-by-case basis. In this particular set of facts that you're looking at, does this seem important or not? You cannot establish a checklist that says you got 3 out of 4 and you're okay. That's not really good enough under the legal standard. It has to be assessed altogether. And the other thing to do is to look for analogies. So as I said, looking at a bunch of examples is the best way to kind of get a sense of how this works. And this is a good tool that's available for finding those analogies. We're going to talk through some examples, but there are always more coming up. This is an index that the US Copyright Office puts together that gives you kind of they do a like one-page PDF summary of each of these cases. You can filter it by the type of thing that is being discussed, and that's kind of a good way if you have a specific case that you're trying to figure out what the prevailing opinion about is. This is a good resource for that. So let's start looking at some examples. So the first couple of examples I'm going to go through are visual art. And visual art is kind of a good frame, a good basis to begin with here. So this first example is a case called Blanche v. Koons. It starts with this photograph that was written by, that was taken by a photographer whose last name is Blanche, and I'm forgetting her first name, apologies. But she took this photograph for use in an advertisement. This is the advertisement. It's, I believe the thing being sold is the shoes. And this appeared in various magazines. So after Blanche takes this photograph, we then get an artist, Jeff Koons, who uses this as kind of an aspect of a collage. That collage, you can see it here. You can see it incorporates elements of several things. One of them, it is the second set of feet from the left, rotated and without the background are the feet from Blanche's photo. And so then the question is this a fair use? So here's the side-by-side. And here's how the analysis comes out. So the court says that under the first factor, it favors fair use. They say it's transformative. They bring in that kind of parodic commentary, satire sort of element of it. They think that Koons's art is kind of poking fun at the commercialism of the advertisement in the original. All right. The nature of the original, they say that this doesn't favor fair use. It's creative, but the court kind of says, I don't really care. This is an example of the second factor not really being terribly informative. The amount taken, they say that this is reasonable in the light of the transformative purpose. He wanted feet, he only took the feet, he didn't take the background. Okay. And they say that there is minimal or no market impact. There's no market harm that results from this use. She wasn't licensing the photo for artistic transformations, and she wasn't licensing the photo much at all. So overall, the court says that this is a fair use. Okay, so that's one example. The next example involves another photographer and then the same artist. So this is Roger versus Koons. This time the photographer Rogers takes this photo of a couple. They were friends of his holding a bunch of puppies, very cute photo. And he was a commercial photographer. He was selling this photo. I believe it was on a couple of postcards, but not a huge operation, but was being sold. And then Jeff Koons, the same artist as before, sees it, decides that it would be a good subject, and creates this sculpture. So this is a three-dimensional sculpture with two people also holding a row of puppies. It is very similar and very similar fact pattern to the case. The photographer sees this, says, hey, that's my thing, objects, and the question for the court is this a fair use? In this case, however, here's the side-by-side. And in this case, however, it comes out as this isn't a fair use. This is an infringement. And the court says that under the first factor, so there was some aspect of bad faith here. There was some aspect of there was some evidence that Jeff Koons was trying to hide that this had previously been a photograph and kind of avoid paying for it when he should have. That didn't do him any favors in the court. It was commercial use. And the main thing under the transformative argument here is that the court argued that he wasn't commenting on the Rogers photo. So unlike in the Blanche example, where it was kind of commenting on the commerciality and using ads in order to do this, this was just a photo that he thought was cool, that he thought would make a good subject for a sculpture, and then did it. And the court says that that's not transformative. Under the second factor, the nature of the original. This is a creative photo. That doesn't help. The amount taken, they say that this is copied the essence of the photograph. It's copied pretty much all of the elements that make it a creative, copyrightable photo. And the market impact, they say that the market for the photo has been prejudiced against Rogers. They kind of infer some negative market impact there. So same artist doing similar things in both cases. One turns out to be a fair use, the other doesn't. Hopefully that helps give a little bit of a sense of where the lines are, but let's try applying it. So those are both older cases. This is a very recent case, and one of several recent cases that I'm going to talk about. So this is Warhol versus Goldsmith. And it starts with the photo on the left here, which is a photo of the musician Prince. It was licensed in 1984 to Vanity Fair magazine. So this was a professional portrait taken by a celebrity photographer named Goldsmith. Got Prince into a studio, told him where to stand, how to look, what to wear, all of that stuff. This photo results from it. The photographer licenses that to Vanity Fair for a specific illustration created by Andy Warhol, which is this example on the right. So this is the licensed use. And then unknown to the photographer, Warhol also created a whole series of similar images at the same time. So these images were the Prince series. There were 14 silkscreen images, 2 pencil illustrations. And at this point, the Andy Warhol Foundation asserts copyright in the images. So the original photographer finds out about this after Prince's death in 2016. Prince is big news again, and Vanity Fair runs a different image from the Prince series on the cover of a commemorative issue. So Goldsmith says, hey, that isn't the image that I thought that they were licensed to make. This is an infringement of the copyright in my photo. So the question is this a fair use? We can do this a little bit interactively. You should be able to go to slido.com and enter that 6-digit number. And let's talk through the factors. So let's start with the first fair use factor. So the purpose and character of the thing that is being used. Do you think that that argues for fair use or against? And that's really about, is this a transformative use of the photo into the Warhol artwork? We do not seem to think that that helps the fair use argument. I'm giving people just a little bit more time. There are 30 people in here and only 3 have voted, so. Okay. Let's do a little bit of free response. Why do you think that? Either way, you can think it's fair use, you can think it's not, but What makes you think that this is transformative or this isn't under the first fair use factor? It is a Friday afternoon and it is snowing, so I understand. Okay, no commentary or other transformation of purpose. Yep, that is definitely a good argument. Yeah, so we do also have this aspect of it that they went and got rights before, and then this time they just didn't. That does seem to have been fairly persuasive to the court. There's a little bit of that bad faith coming in here. With that said, I will say that having asked and been refused permission doesn't preclude fair use. We saw that in the Two Life Crew case. You can still comment on something without getting approval. That's an important First Amendment aspect of fair use. But yeah, the argument here that that the court does seem to find most persuasive is that there isn't really new expression going on here. The photo and the screen print, and I can go back so that you can see the side by side. This isn't quite the side by side, but this is more or less it. The photo and the screen print. The screen print isn't really commenting on the photo. They both are just trying to kind of represent what Prince looks like. They're trying to create a portrait of a person. The sort of argument that Goldsmith tried to make was that the photo was trying to show kind of a introverted, more introspective, kind of less pop sort of version of Prince, and then Warhol came in and did the Warhol thing and tried to make it, pop culture and a little bit more vibrant, and that they were trying to express different aspects of Prince's personality. They were trying to reflect on different things here. Court didn't really buy that. The court said it's basically an image of Prince. Okay, so that's the first factor. Let's quickly just to kind of practice what this looks like. Let's sorry, I've got too many windows. I'm going to reset this poll and let's do it again, but for the second factor. So the second factor is the nature of the work. So the nature of the photograph that was taken, is that factual and published, which would argue, factual and published would argue for fair use, creative and unpublished would argue against fair use. Yeah, it's kind of, I can see it both ways. I can see why this is flipping around. It's certainly anyone who takes photography like this wants to say that this is a very creative endeavor. On the other hand, it is also a picture of a person that is trying to portray the way they look. So that I can see how that can go either way. I'll reset it again and let's see what we think about the third factor. So the third factor is the amount of the use. So how much of the creative expression in the original photo is being taken and used by the Warhol screen print. If it's a lot or if it's too much, then that argues against fair use. Okay. If I'm just being contrary and arguing against the majority here, I would say that the original photo is it's head to knees. It's more of his body, whereas Warhol is focusing just on the face. But I think the majority of you are probably correct that it is kind of taking the essence of it, which is his face. And then the fourth factor. So then the fourth factor, the market harm, is this something where the allegedly infringing use, the potential fair use, is infringing on the market for the original photograph? Okay. So let's, I'll go ahead and jump as to what the court says. This is kind of my summary of the court's decision. This was in the Second Circuit in last March. So they did say that all of these argued against fair use. They said that the overarching purpose and function of the two works here is identical. There's a customary licensing price that hasn't been made. There is kind of a norm under the fourth factor, and they also kind of bring it into the first factor discussion, that there is a licensing market that should have been utilized here and wasn't. And they say that the most distinctive elements were copied. So that is this decision. This decision is being appealed. So, this may not be the final word on this. We will see. I think there are some things in what the court said about this that are not quite right, but a court said them, and I am not a court. So for now, at least if you're in the Second Circuit, which is the jurisdiction that includes New York City, then this is the law there currently. Let me just pause for a second and see if there are any questions.
We've got some questions, but they're not about this specifically. So if you want to go through some more and then we can do questions at the end, or if you want to pause for some specific examples.
Let's pause now and
okay.
Question.
So the first one that came in is, what rights do you need to use a video, including the sound recording and syncing? And use the whole thing. The big one.
Yes. That is a big one. So there are a lot of copyrightable things that can go into a video. Generally, there's if you're creating the video, then you're creating the copyright in the video. With any sort of background music, you would also need rights in that, and any other third-party materials that you're using in it. So any artwork that appears in the background, sometimes you would need to clear, and then the source material that you're creating a video from, if that is copyrightable, then that is also potentially something that copyright could apply to and would need to be cleared. I think beyond that is a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but there's certainly a lot of copyright concerns to be thinking about if you're working with video.
So this next one is kind of long, so I'm going to put it in the chat also. You can check if we're in the Q&A, but the gist of it is around how far you can take parody and everything. So the example, if I created a video game with Darth Vader, who has a typically high gravitas as a character, and recast him as a character more defined by the opposite characteristics, like a servant, or just like lots of something different, call him that, even like identify him as that, would that still be able to count as a fair use?
Potentially, yes. So I suppose this is the point where I should say that I'm not your lawyer and I cannot give you advice. But yes, that sort of thing that's exactly the sort of thing that is protected under fair use, and kind of that sort of parodic aspect of it is kind of the core of fair use. And a lot of you do see Darth Vader parodies on in various media. I don't know what percentage of that is licensed versus relying on fair use, but I would imagine some of it is definitely relying on fair use.
And we have one more question, which is, are there national organizations or associations that scan the landscape in this area and provide educational conferences? And the question asker is specifically interested in anything relative to healthcare innovations.
So I'm not terribly aware of healthcare innovation research, but certainly there are plenty of people that keep an eye on fair use. So the the index link that I linked to from the United States Copyright Office links to that's a good source for kind of rounding up all of the cases that have a fair use component to them. Then depending on the market sector, there are usually some industry sources. I don't have any for healthcare off the top of my head, but Hollywood Reporter, for example, is actually really good at reporting on copyright developments in the entertainment industry, but that's not really going to help you in healthcare.
That's all the questions we have so far.
Cool.
Thanks for sending in your questions, everybody. Keep sending them.
Keep them coming. Okay, so we've looked at a couple of cases about visual art. I'm going to jump topics now to another case that's been in the news recently. And this is another pretty big fair use case, but we're going to jump to the software context. So this case is Oracle v. Google. These are both very big names in the tech industries. And what this case is about is a dispute about the use of some aspects of Java code in Google's development of the Android operating system. So there's a lot of background here that I'm going to try and cut a little bit short, but so Google was developing the operating system for Android smartphones. This is a few years ago now. And they're developing Android. They initially wanted to develop it so that you could program in it in Java. They were negotiating with Oracle, which owns Java. In order to do that, negotiations didn't really work out, so they couldn't use Java. They decided to build it themselves, but they wanted people who were familiar with Java, who were familiar with programming for Java, to be able to program easily for Android. So they didn't want people to have to learn a whole new programming language, basically, in order to program on their system, because if they did that, then no one would use their system and it would never catch on. So that's kind of the context there. So what they did is they reprogrammed everything. They rewrote all of the declaring code, but they copied from Java the structure of 37 Java packages and their components. And the distinction that the court draws here, and I will apologize because I'm not a programmer, so I'm saying this the way the court says it, which is undoubtedly a little bit wrong. But the distinction that's being drawn here is between the declaring code and the implementing code. So the implementing code is the code that actually does the thing, and there are multiple ways that you can do the thing. This is a very simple example in front of how do you determine which of two numbers is the largest. There are multiple ways that you can tell a computer to do that. And Google rewrote all of that. They didn't copy any of that from Java. Obviously, the functions get much more complicated than this. This is a very simple example, but they did all of that themselves. But what they copied is the way that you access that function. So the declaring code is, so you want the computer to figure out which of these two numbers is largest. This is the key command that you use in order to trigger that function. And I wanted people to be able to call on the kind of basic components of things that their system would do for you. They want people to be able to call on that without learning new names for them, basically. So Oracle was unhappy with that. 10 years of litigation later, we're in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is deciding whether or not this is a fair use to copy this implementing code. And let's just spend just a few minutes thinking this through. I'm interested in what your thoughts are. You can put them in the chat. And do you think this is a fair use? Do you think it should be a fair use? And if you feel like I haven't given you enough information, what information would you want? We have a comment in the Q&A that says chat is disabled. Sorry about that. That has changed. I think. Someone say hi in the chat to see if we can. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we have a vote for fair use. A vote against. This is good. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and cut to the chase of what the Supreme Court says. Here's the summary. You're welcome to read the case yourself. It is at that link, which is in the which is in the slides, which you will also have access to. And the court says that this is a fair use. So overall, they go through the factors. Under the first factor, they say that this is a transformative use. They say that this is, they give credence to the idea that it's a new platform and it's a different medium. So there's a distinction being drawn between desktop computing and smartphone computing and programming for both of those. The court finds that persuasive. And really the court focuses on this kind of aspect of skills transfer, that the thing that is valuable here is not the creativity that Oracle has put into what their declaring code says. The thing that is valuable here is the skills of the programmers who have learned how to use this language to their advantage. And the court says that's not something that Oracle has the right to control, which is kind of an interesting aspect of a fair use analysis that hasn't really come up too much before. So that's what they say on the first factor. On the second factor, they say a similar thing to what a couple of people have said in the chat, that this is math. This isn't super creative. This is organizational functionality. This is more like a dictionary than a novel. This isn't the most. This isn't what we want copyright to protect. We want people to be able to build off of things in this sort of way. And the court actually gives greater weight to the second factor than many things in recent history. So this is, perhaps we will see an increase in the second factor in at least as regards to software copyright. We will see. On the amount of copying, there were arguments both ways. Oracle was saying they used all of the declaring code. They used 100% of it. Google was saying, well, we used all of the declaring code, but if you actually look at the number of lines, that is, it's 0.4% of the total lines used, because most of it is that implementing code. So they're only using 0.4% of the total code used. The court found that more persuasive than Oracle's argument. And they also said that it was the amount was suited to the transformative purpose. So it's suited to the purpose of allowing people to make this kind of skills transfer of using this thing. They weren't using more than they had to. And then they also, as I said, credited the difference between the markets, smartphone and desktop. They said that there was some factual evidence presented that Oracle was not moving into the smartphone market. They weren't taking advantage of it. Therefore, fair use should allow someone else to step in, basically. And I see in the chat, Mark has mentioned the Lotus 123 case. Yes, this is relying heavily on that same sort of argument there. So the previous generation of this case was with spreadsheet software in the 70s and 80s, and whether or not you could copyright the way that the keystroke commands that you use to control C, control V, is that something that can be proprietary? There was an earlier case that said that that can't be. Okay, so that is Oracle v. Google. As I mentioned, that's a very recent case. That was April of last year. So we're still very much seeing what's going to develop from that, how that's going to affect future cases going forward. But very much something to be aware of if you're involved with copyrighted software. Okay, so I'm just going to throw a couple more cases at you because as I said, fair use is very broad. Fair use covers a lot of different things. And we've covered a lot of the kind of parity aspects of it. And I want to demonstrate that it can also be broader than that. So we have a couple of cases where the focus is on copying the whole thing and maybe being less transformative. So the first case in this example is the Google Books case. So most of you are probably familiar with Google Books. It's a project that Google started 20 years ago now. They worked with university libraries, actually, and libraries had millions and millions of books in physical formats. Google wanted to digitize those. So Google digitized literally the full text of millions of books and put them into the Google Books database. Now, what they didn't do was allow you to read the full book unless it's not under copyright. So if it's not under copyright, you can read it. If it is under copyright, they still copied it, but you can't read it. What you can do is you can search within it. So you can find out, does this thing appear in this book? It serves an indexing function of figuring out what is in there. And they give you kind of some context around your search keys. They search results. They give you what they call a snippet view of 3 lines or so around your search results. So you can kind of see the context. You can figure out if maybe it was a typo or maybe it's a homonym instead of the thing you were thinking of. You can get a little bit of it, but they put various safeguards in place such that you can't actually sequentially read a whole book through Google Books if it is a book that they've determined is in copyright. So that's a lot of copying. That is the full text of many, 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 many books. A lot of publishers were very unhappy about that. They said this is not a fair use. Google said that it was. And many years of litigation later, the result comes out and it is a fair use. So the court says that it is highly transformative because the purpose is not to read the books, but to enable these other functions, to enable search, research, indexing. You can do lots of interesting things with the Google Books corpus. You can do sentiment analysis over word frequency over time. You can do lots of things that knowing what all of the words in a book are facilitates that you need to have all of the words in a book to do, but that aren't just reading the book, which would be the main purpose, as the court characterized it, of the printed volume. The nature of the copyrighted work, there are all kinds of works involved. The fair use analysis could be stronger for some than for others, but it would be stronger for nonfiction. All of these books are published. Second factor doesn't weigh too heavily. Under the third factor, they say that this weighs against fair use, but only slightly. Even though they're copying the full text, literally all of millions of books, they say that this only slightly weighs against fair use because it's necessary for the transformative purpose. You can't search an entire book if you don't have a copy of the whole book. And they weren't letting people read the whole copy of the book. So the court said that this was reasonable. And then the potential market impact, they said that scans and snippet views don't serve as a market replacement for the books. So they basically found that people aren't using Google Books instead of going out and buying a book. They're using it for different purposes, tying the market impact back into the first factor. Okay, so that's Google Books. Another case that is kind of interesting as a follow-on to that is Fox versus TV Eyes. So TV Eyes was, might still be, I'm not sure, it was basically trying to be the Google Books for cable news television, basically. So the idea was they would index all of the TV that's happening 24/7, and you'd be able to search through it, and you could search for January 6th insurrection and figure out see side by side what everyone was saying about it. You could analyze it based on that, see when people were saying the same things, when people were saying different things. And it was going to be basically Google Books for TV news. They were unsuccessful though. So this one was determined to not be a fair use by the court. And so what's the difference between Google Books and TV Eyes? In some ways, TV Eyes didn't do as good enough of a job. So their snippet view wasn't 3 lines, it was 10 minutes. So the court thought that it was kind of excessive and that you could watch 10 minutes of a news show, which might be several topical, distinct topical clips, just based on having searched for something within one of them. And you could, and they didn't have the same safeguards that Google had about, you could, in theory, apparently with TV Eyes, get a 10-minute clip, then search for something that was at the end of that 10-minute clip, get the next 10-minute clip, and then keep doing that and watch the entire thing. That sounds like a really unpleasant way to watch television to me, but it was theoretically possible, and that harmed their fair use analysis. They said it was somewhat transformative, but largely they found that it was kind of substituting for television watching. The other thing under the 4th factor, they found that they found some credibility to a plausible market here. Fox, which was the main plaintiff here, introduced some evidence that they had been, they might have been licensing a similar product. This was also a paid product, not a free product like Google Books. And that seems to have weighed a little bit against them.
Okay, we got a question in specifically for the Authors Guild Google Book case. Do you know how this applies to commercially sold data sets, especially where the vendors have agreements you have to sign that say you won't create or sell either raw or derived data? Does fair use potentially get you around this?
That is an excellent question. And so the answer is that fair use will help with the copyright portion of it. But if it's a licensed data set, then you're signing a contract in order to, you're signing a contract in order to get access to that data set. And if the contract says that you can't do that, then it may not be a copyright infringement. It may not be a copyright infringement to share the derived data, for example, but it would be a breach of that contract. So you could still be sued for breach of contract instead of copyright. There are some differences to breach of contract suits versus copyright suits, but you still probably don't want to be sued for breach of contract. So, so it helps a little bit, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. Okay. So one more comprehensive copying case, just to, this is an interestingly an interestingly creative example. So this is Turnitin, which some of you might be familiar with. And this is plagiarism checking software. So this is software. The idea behind it is if you're a teacher and you assign an essay, your students turn in the essay to you, you submit the essay through this software, and this software has access to a database of a large volume of published work and also all of the student work from your other students and from last year's students and from everyone else at the school and all the other schools that use Turnitin. And it will tell you this work is very similar to this thing over here, or hey, this paper is exactly the same as this paper that was turned in last year. It's a useful tool for potentially identifying plagiarism. Now, there's plenty that can be said about problems with this software that are beyond the scope here. There's plenty of privacy concerns. There's plenty of potential to misuse this and accidentally categorize things as plagiarism because it's not going to get it right 100% of the time. Putting that a little bit aside, there was a group of students whose written work as part of their schoolwork, their schools required them to submit the work in order to get the degree, and the work was required to go through Turnitin, and so their work was involuntarily added to this plagiarism database. They said this is copyright infringement, and then the question is this a fair use? So let's, I'm going to pause for a second and let's talk in the chat a little bit. Do you think that's a fair use? Okay. So the court agrees with you guys. The court says that this is, that this is a different purpose. The reason that you're turning in your essay is to get graded and to learn and to get your degree, whatever your motivations are. But the motivations of Turnitin are to detect copying, which is very different. The court also gives some credit to this having a substantial public benefit in identifying plagiarism that they credit towards this. The nature of the copyrighted work, these are all unpublished papers that are being submitted, unless they're plagiarizing. But these are all unpublished papers, but the court doesn't really credit that. This isn't supplanting first publication. It's not as though anyone can read the papers after they're submitted to Turnitin. They're just being used for this kind of indexing fashion. The amount of the copying, it is copying the entire thing, but the court says that it's neutral in this case. And they say that there's no potential market impact. You're not going to be able to not publish your paper, for example, because it's been through Turnitin, because it's not releasing it to the world. It's a very different function. So that is a case of a fairly creative fair use. And although I also agree there are probably some other considerations that we should keep in mind with that software. Okay, so to bring it a little bit closer to home, maybe for some of us, let's think about now not cases that have been decided, but situations where you might be considering fair use in your own work. So just as a hypothetical, you're an academic, you're writing an academic article on the use of color in pop cultural representations. Would you want to use this image from the Warhol Prince series in your article? Is it a fair use? Why or why not? Okay, yeah, it's non-commercial. That helps. Other things that help with it being a fair use? learning and teaching. Yep. Yeah, commentary. I would say commentary is going to be a big one here. So it would be very hard to write an academic commentary on the way that the lines are drawn in this image without having a reference that people can look at to know what you're talking about while you say it, right? So, and if you're commenting on it, if you're saying, this is what Warhol meant when he did this, or this is what I think Warhol meant, then you're commenting on it directly, and that's also going to help. Direct connection to an educational mission totally helps. Does anyone think that it might not be a fair use? Or anyone have any concerns about doing that? Okay, so I'm not going to discourage anyone from saying this is a fair use. I think it is a fair use. In practice, if you were trying to get this article published, you would have a lot of trouble, you would have a lot of trouble with this. So what would happen is your publisher would say, okay, you have to get permission from that. You would have to go to the Warhol estate. The Warhol estate would say, okay, that'll be $10,000. You might also have to go to Goldsmith because this wasn't a fair use. So whatever the original copyright, if it's still in there, you may also have to go to her, and it can be a problem. So this is one of the reasons that it's really good to be aware of fair use, be able to strongly understand what makes this a fair use, and be able to make the argument and advocate for yourself that it's going to be a fair use, because it certainly happens that this could prohibit you from writing about this particular topic, because it can get prohibitively expensive when it shouldn't be expensive at all, because it's a fair use that you don't have to pay for. So yeah, these are all good. These are good discussion points. Is the image being used as a primary draw of viewers? Yeah, if your article is being published in a light glossy coffee table book, and it seems like the commentary is just kind of cover for this is pretty and I want to use it, then that's going to be less strong of a fair use. That's going to detract from your fair use argument. But if it's in an academic publication, the only people who are going to see it are going to be other people who are commenting on pop art culture, then that's going to help your argument. Same thing with non-commerciality and educational purposes. Okay. Okay, there it is. So just another example, this one probably even closer to home. You're writing an academic paper. It's not on something like Warhol. It's just, in this case, on adenocarcinoma in mice. And you find a figure in an MIT thesis. It comes up in your literature review. You want to include the thesis in your paper when you're covering your literature review. Is that a fair use? Yeah. So yes. Yes, let's go ahead and assume it's properly cited and everything. So this is an interesting use case, because this is really where most people actually practically encounter fair use, and it's also an area where we don't actually have a lot of case law examples. This sort of thing doesn't really go to court, which should be good news, actually, if you're publishing this. The dispute here tends to not rise to that level. I can see the argument either way. I will credit that. And it kind of depends on what you're doing with it, right? So if you're using this to build your argument, you're saying, here's the previous research, here's what this slide shows, that's why I'm looking over here for this. And I'm not a mouse researcher, so I don't know what you'd be looking for. But if you're using it to establish the body of literature that you're building off of, then that goes towards a transformative purpose of, this person was saying this about this research. Now because they've said that, I can say this. On the other hand, you are kind of using it for a similar sort of purpose. You're conveying information. You're conveying the information from the previous picture, from the previous paper. So in general, this is going to be a fairly standard fair use. This is something that this is also something that I would encourage you to advocate for as a fair use. It is easy to get into a cycle of you should get permission for all features, for all figures, but you don't necessarily have to. This can be a fair use. Okay. Next example, you're training a machine learning algorithm on newspaper headlines, and you need a whole bunch of news that you're getting from the internet. Can that be a fair use? All right. Yes, so I would tend to agree, certainly. This is something that people who want you to pay them will argue with you about this. But this pretty squarely falls into the Google Books sort of category of, you're using it for a new purpose. You're using it for a new purpose, you're transforming it. It may depend on how much you're disclosing about it. So, if you're using it to train your algorithm and then you're not using it again, that's one thing. If you have to have a methods section and disclose the data that you're using and stuff like that, then it might get a little bit more complicated. But the basic training really should be a fair use. Okay. And so that is really all that I have. We can talk a little bit about fair uses that you guys have made, or I can address any remaining questions. I also have a slide of resources that you can rely on, and the MIT libraries are here to answer your fair use questions. As I said previously, we cannot give you legal advice, but we can give you the information that you need in order to make an informed decision yourself. So if you have fair use questions about a particular project you're working on, if you'd like someone to think it through with you, we are available for that. And we're also available for the next 10 minutes if you would like to ask any questions. I see we have a question about compulsory music licensing. That is a very big topic that I usually have to look up every single time it comes up. So compulsory licensing, music copyright gets very, very complicated, and there are various licensing regimes that come into it more automatically than in other spheres. So in music, it is sometimes easier to automatically get a license, and you can do that through licensing organizations that most, at least mainstream media, has signed up with. So there are different rights for sound recordings versus compositions, and then different kind of subsets of rights that you can get licensed. There's different rights for using it with film versus versus using it on the radio, things like that. And that is, I think, beyond the scope of what I can talk about right now, but is definitely a good thing to talk to someone about if you have a bunch of questions. And you're welcome to email me if you'd like.
There's some more questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can see the chat at this point. So what about biocompounds and copyright? So biological compounds are usually not going to be copyrightable. So I didn't really talk about what is copyrightable and what isn't here, but the basics of that are things that are copyrightable have to be created by someone. It's a creative output of someone's mind, basically, and something that is occurring naturally. That thing in itself is probably not going to be copyrightable. There may be things around it that are. There may be, certainly the article that you write about it is, and algorithms that you write about it might be, but not the thing itself.
Going back to the newspaper example, the headlines one, what does it change if you use the whole newspaper article in your machine learning case rather than just the headlines?
If anything, I think it would. If anything, I think it would reduce the fair use likelihood because you're using more of it. But if you need to use all of it, you can. So it would be like the Google Books case where you're using you're copying the entire book because you need to train your algorithm on the entire thing. So if that's important for the transformative purpose that you're doing, then that's going to be fine.
And then another one from Mark. There's one in the in the chat, but there's also one in the Q&A, which is review articles such as the ones in medicine sometimes only seem to have the purpose of aggregating existing knowledge. Does this come under fair use if key pieces of some of that research are excerpted as key to the summary for that piece of knowledge?
Largely, yes. So some of that is going to be that it doesn't involve copyright at all. So if you're just referencing someone, if you're citing someone and summarizing what they've said, then that doesn't have any copyright implications at all. That's you paraphrasing someone. Paraphrasing, depending on how close it is, could get a little bit iffy, but if you're just saying that, so-and-so, according to so-and-so, here's X, Y, and Z, you're reporting on facts that exist, that person said that thing, and that's not going to have a copyright implication. If you're quoting them, if you're quoting their actual words or reusing figure, then that is going to involve copyright, and that is generally going to be a fair use if it's small and relevant to your argument. And fair use is really is designed to be reasonable. It is designed to be, if you have a good reason to do it, then we don't want to make it illegal, right? Like if you need this argument in order to do science, then that is one of the things that copyright wants to facilitate, and fair use is how it avoids getting in the way of that, basically. So I see copyrightability versus patentability. And I will say straight off that I am not the most knowledgeable person about patents. So I'm not the best person to talk about patentability. There are a lot of other really good sessions in this TLO series about patentability. But in general, copyright covers creative expression, and patents cover methods or it's also 4:30 on a Friday. So it's they do sometimes have overlapping subject matter. Software in particular is one area where things can be both both copyrightable and patentable. But in general, creativity, functionality, kind of, that probably wasn't super helpful, I'm sorry. And I'm not familiar with TensorFlow, so I'm not sure about that one. Let's see, copying a few pages from a book in a library for learning purpose is a fair use. I certainly hope so. It's going to, the formal answer to that is it's going to come down to the four-factor analysis, and you are actually supposed to do a fair use analysis in every case. So in general, that's going to be a strong argument. You're not going to be, if it's something that you wouldn't have been buying otherwise, then it's not going to have a market impact under the fourth factor. If it's just a few pages, it's going to be a minimal impact under the third factor. Depending on what it is, it could go either way under the second factor. But if it's, factual information that you're getting from a book because you want the information in it, then that would argue for fair use. And then the transformativeness is also going to come down to what the thing is. If it's, if it's actually if it's intended as an educational material, if it's textbook, that actually argues that it's less strong of a fair use to get a copy from a library because you're using it for the original purpose it was created, versus maybe reading a novel for getting a novel out of the library for learning purposes instead of for entertainment, has a stronger argument that it's a fair use. But in general, small amounts, relatively safe to assume that you are supposed to do the analysis each time. Libraries do that too. Printing material that is only available online for studying purposes. So I think what you're getting at there is kind of format shifting it. So it's available online, and then you don't like reading on screens, you want to print out, so you're printing it out. So you are in fact making a copy. You're making a copy of it, but you're making a copy of it kind of for your own benefit. You're the only person who's going to read it. You're going to be okay with that. And we do have, so there's the case that I will point you to for that being, yes, a fair use, is the Sony Betamax case. So this was a very early Supreme Court case on fair use, very early and foundational on fair use, about whether the whole concept of VCRs and recording things, actually not VCRs, Betamax tapes, is infringement. And the argument there was format shifting it from live television, recording live television onto a tape so that you could watch it later. That could be a fair use. So I would not worry too much about printing off.
Katie, is that's the same for like copying something that's in a library book that the library only has physically, but you don't want to check the whole book out. You just want to copy the chapter you need and bring it with you? Maybe. So I can't actually point you to a case on this. It's I hesitate to because it's like 900 pages long, but it's libraries have gone to court over this, over library copying, basically, for electronic reserves for courses. So you have a reading for class. You don't want everyone to have to buy the whole book. It's only 2 chapters out of the whole book or whatever it is. So you upload it onto a course site. Is that a fair use? And the answer is yes, usually. 10 years of litigation later, we know yes, usually. But you are supposed to do that analysis in every single case. Yes, course packs. Frequently, course packs are actually licensed. I'm not sure why that's different. I think it's just they developed differently historically.
but frequently the course pack that you would get through the bookstore is licensed. But you could do electronic versus print isn't going to make a huge difference in the fair use case there.
And just to round us out we're at time, but just this last question that Mark snuck in at the end. If you were recording it off the air and then selling it rather than just recording it so you could watch it later when it wasn't on, that would not be acceptable, correct?
That's certainly harder. That's certainly a harder fair use case. If I were the lawyer arguing for the person who was selling that recording, I could come up with some things to say. If the recording isn't otherwise available, then arguably you're not infringing on the market for it, right? Because there's no other market for it. It might be a plausible market if recordings are just starting to be developed and it makes sense that they would sell them, then that's not going to be a super persuasive argument. But the mere fact of selling it doesn't necessarily change things. There are plenty of highly commercial fair uses, and the Oracle v. Google is a really good example of one. The Two Live Crew case is also an example of one. It's the fact that something is commercial is not does not preclude fair use. I would not go quite so far as to say that that bootlegged concert recordings are always okay, but potentially.
Yeah, to be honest, as someone who used to work in audiovisual archives, a lot of times the groups that you took the recording of are very interested in those. Probably they don't want you to be making money off of them, but they're very interested because they don't always have really good recordings of everything and they get interested in them later. So I know a couple of bands that were like asking fans, did you illegally record us ever? We want to see that. So it can be interesting. And this takes us now over 2 minutes over. So thank you, Katie, for a great presentation. And thank you everyone for attending. Did you want to say anything about the rest of the series?
Yes, there is another